Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going over two incredibly disturbing disappearances, one of which has one of the most disturbing scenes I've ever encountered. I know I say that a lot, and it is genuine when I say it each time, but this one in particular really bothered me. You'll see what I mean, and although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they're still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Angela, also known as Angie Houseman, was born in St. Louis, Missouri on February 18, 1984. When she was a toddler, her mother married her stepfather, and afterwards, she and her family lived comfortable middle-class lives in St. Anne, Missouri, just a few miles northwest of downtown St. Louis. For 9-year-old Angie, Thursday, November 18, 1993, started like nearly every other weekday. At the time, Angie was a 4th grader, and that morning she got up early and ate breakfast with her family before setting off for the bus stop down the street. As far as we know, she had a relatively uneventful day. Then when the bell rang that afternoon, she and her classmates who lived nearby got back onto the bus for the return trip home. One or two parents usually met the kids at the bus stop in the afternoon to make sure they got home okay, but that day the children had to walk home alone because nobody was there when the bus arrived. Even so, this wasn't really a big deal. The sun hadn't set, the neighborhood was generally safe, and everyone lived within a few blocks of the bus stop. As they walked, the children broke up into little groups and eventually turned off onto different streets, but for some reason, Angie ended up walking by herself that day. Angie's mother and stepfather got worried when she still hadn't shown up 30 minutes later than usual. They then made a few phone calls and eventually began searching the neighborhood, but at that point, they still weren't that alarmed. They figured they'd find her playing or chatting with friends nearby, but Angie never turned up, and as the sun began to set, her increasingly frantic mother picked up the phone, called the police, and told them that her 9-year-old daughter was missing. Within hours, friends, neighbors, relatives, and police officers were scouring the neighborhood and calling out Angie's name at the top of their lungs, but neither she nor any of her personal items turned up. For her family, the horrible night seemed like it would never end. The search continued into the following morning, and later that day, investigators conducted dozens of interviews to see if they could shed any light on her disappearance. Meanwhile, as word spread, the police were inundated with tips and alleged sightings around St. Louis and across the state. And in fact, one caller said a little girl barely escaped the week before when an unidentified male tried to abduct her near St. Anne. Another tipster reported seeing a suspicious man driving around town in a dark car just hours before Angie went missing. But even so, the case went cold, or at least for the next week it did. 9 days after she went missing, the case became even more heartbreaking and horrific. On November 27th, a lone deer hunter found Angie's body in the Bush Wildlife Area, about 25 miles west of St. Anne. And before continuing on, again, I want to warn everyone that there's just no way to sugarcoat the following information. Angie was found without clothing, handcuffed, bound to a tree, and deceased when the hunter found her. Except for a small opening for her mouth, her head was almost entirely wrapped in duct tape. She also had deep cuts on her arms and legs, and her abductor had stuffed a piece of her pink underwear into her mouth, likely to keep her quiet. During the autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Angie had been repeatedly assaulted and left to die in the forest. But maybe most tragically, despite the severity of her wounds, the medical examiner concluded that she died from hypothermia and that she was probably still alive just an hour or two before the hunter found her. After this horrific news came out, hundreds of investigators from law enforcement agencies began working the case from every angle. But even so, nearly 2 decades eventually passed without an arrest. It wasn't until finally in 2018 when forensic lab techs re-examined the DNA samples taken from Angie's underwear. With newer technology, they quickly determined that there were actually 2 samples present. The identity of the second person was initially a mystery, but that changed in early 2019 when they ran the sample through the Combined DNA Index system. Lo and behold, it matched DNA from St. Louis native, ex-serviceman, and convicted predator Earl Cox. Earl Cox was born and raised in St. Louis, but he spent nearly a decade in Germany after enlisting in the Air Force in 1974. We don't know much about his service record other than that he was dishonorably discharged in 1982 for committing multiple offenses against juvenile victims while stationed in Germany. For these offenses, he was court-martialed and sentenced to 8 years at the notorious Federal Correctional Institution in Leavenworth, Kansas. Surprisingly though, Earl was paroled in 1985 after serving just 1/3 of his sentence. Then in 1988, he got his parole transferred to Missouri, where he moved in with relatives just a few miles from St. Anne. In October of the following year, he was once again convicted of an offense against a 7-year-old girl at a park behind the local elementary school. As a result, his parole was revoked and he was sent back to Leavenworth to serve out the remainder of the previous sentence. Surprisingly though, he was paroled again in late 1992, and these incidents were only a fraction of the depraved actions he was truly capable of. Earl was then charged with kidnapping, sodomy, and first-degree murder shortly thereafter, but at the time he was actually already serving a sentence in North Carolina for a recent child pornography conviction. And incredibly, somehow he actually wasn't in prison. Instead, he was in a state-run medical facility where he was apparently undergoing predator rehabilitation. Earl was then extradited to Missouri shortly after the new charges were filed, and in the summer of 2020, he pleaded guilty to several charges. By then, he'd also had a stroke and was in poor health, and considering his age and the time-consuming nature of the appeals process, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. As part of this deal, Earl waived his right to an appeal and agreed to spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also agreed to tell investigators and prosecutors the whole story without omitting even the smallest detail. According to Earl, initially, Angie's abduction wasn't planned. Instead, he said it was a crime of opportunity that arose when he had car trouble the afternoon she disappeared. He claimed that he pulled over in St. Anne to see if he could figure out what the problem was. Then, when he was poking around under the hood, he claimed that he looked up at just the moment that Angie and her schoolmates were getting off the bus. And apparently, moments later, he said that she appeared by the car and asked him what was wrong. When pressed, though, Earl admitted that this part of the story wasn't entirely true. He always maintained that he did have car trouble that day, but he eventually admitted that the problem wasn't serious and that he was the one who approached Angie and asked her if she was hungry. She then apparently willingly got into the car with him when he told her he'd take her to Burger King. After that, he said they drove around for a while and that he eventually took her back to his mobile home, locked her in the back bedroom, and repeatedly assaulted her. Surprisingly, he also told investigators that he had a live-in girlfriend at the time. Police questioned her as well, but she was from another country, spoke very little English, and was rarely at home because she worked a lot. But despite this, she actually admitted to knowing that something was going on in the back bedroom. But Earl forbid her from entering the room, and she was too terrified of him to ask what he was up to. After days of this, Earl drove her to the bush wildlife area and bound her to the tree where she was ultimately found. He claims that he intentionally left her in a conspicuous location and that he thought that it would only be a matter of time before someone found her and rescued her. Needless to say, investigators knew this was nonsense. If he wanted her to be found, he could have left her in and around St. Anne in a location where a motorist or pedestrian would have found her within an hour or two. A more likely scenario was that he knew she died in the forest. 67-year-old Earl passed away in the Missouri Delta Medical Center at 9:14 a.m. on Monday, December 2nd, 2024.
Philadelphia in 1945 was like most American cities at the time. World War II had brought rapid industrial growth as soldiers returned home and families adjusted to the new normal of the world. And among the thousands of families carving out their place in this changing world were Jules and Dorothy Forstein. They lived in a comfortable 3-story brick home on North Franklin Street, raising their children and going about life as normal. At a glance, Jules was the picture of respectability. As a judge, he had made his fair share of friends and enemies, but his reputation was that of a fair, friendly man. 5 years earlier, though, in 1940, Jules, who was a clerk at the time, had been married to the mother of his 2 daughters, Marcy and Myrna, but tragically, his first wife passed away during Marcy's birth. As hard as this was, only a year later, Jules would find love again when he met 32-year-old Dorothy Cooper. She supervised the beauty floor at a prominent downtown store, and Dorothy was immediately attractive to Jules. So in 1943 they married, and that same year Jules went from clerk to judge, which was a big lifestyle change from his previous position. Dorothy meanwhile became a doting stepmother, and their household grew even fuller with the birth of their son Edward in 1944. By all accounts, the Forsteins were a happy family. Marcy and Myrna adored their stepmother, and Dorothy showered them with affection. The following year, in 1945, Dorothy spent one January afternoon running errands, shopping, and chatting with friends, which was something she did often. Philadelphia's streets were still busy despite the winter chill, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Dorothy decided it was time to head home. A neighbor apparently later saw her enter the house sometime after 9 o'clock. Several hours later, Jules arrived home and the house was dark, which was highly unusual. Dorothy always left a light on if she expected to be home alone. Jules then let himself in and called out for his wife, expecting the usual loving reply, but there was nothing. He then reached for a light switch and flipped it on before glancing into the living room. Everything was as it should be, but there was no sign of Dorothy. Then he heard a soft sound coming from the closet under the stairs. Jules then stepped forward, pulling aside the coats and scarves, and at first he saw nothing out of place. But then something on the floor slightly shifted. Then he realized it was Dorothy. She was collapsed on the floor, her face covered in blood, and her eyes were swollen shut. Her face was a mess of bruises and gashes, and her blonde hair was matted with blood. When he found her, she had been beaten nearly to death. He then rushed her to a hospital, and as Dorothy was given medical attention, detectives combed through every inch of the house and searched for clues, but they found nothing. There was no sign of forced entry, no drawers had been rifled through, and no money or valuables were missing. Every fingerprint they found could also be traced back to someone in the family, so the attacker, whoever they were, had come for only one reason, and that seemed to be only to brutalize Dorothy. And as a result, Dorothy's injuries were severe. Her jaw had been shattered and needed to be wired shut, she had a bad concussion, and her nose had been broken in such a way that she'd never look the same again. Her right shoulder had also been badly fractured, and unfortunately, she also struggled to remember the attack, and she could only recall a few details. She told detectives she'd walked in as usual and went upstairs to check on the kids who were sleeping soundly upstairs. Then, after walking back downstairs, out of nowhere, someone rushed her. She never saw the face of her attacker, and when police pressed her for details, she could only shake her head to most of the questions. In the weeks that followed, neighbors were questioned one after another, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual except for one. The only witness was the woman who had seen Dorothy return home, and in some reports, she claimed that Dorothy might have been followed by a man, but she couldn't be sure because she didn't pay close enough attention. Jules was also subjected to intense scrutiny. He was a public figure, and that came with enemies. In his time as a judge, he had received the occasional threat, but there was nothing serious to them, and nothing that would have warranted police protection or suggested someone wanted to harm his wife. And as for Jules himself, on the night of the attack, he had been at work surrounded by people. So with him ruled out, investigators turned their attention to Dorothy herself, but her life was by all accounts completely ordinary. She was a devoted wife, a loving mother, and a well-liked woman with no enemies, debts, or scandals. When her jaw had healed enough for her to speak clearly, she did her best to help detectives piece together what had happened. She described her day in painstaking detail, listing the shops she had visited and the friends she had stopped to chat with. And she recalled nothing unusual. The last she remembered was coming down the stairs, and then a shadowy figure came at her fast. She was completely caught off guard and had no time to fight back. She also thought that it might have been a man, but the attack was so sudden and brutal that she couldn't be sure. All she could remember was how relentless it was. And despite exhaustive questioning, there was nothing more she could give them, and the investigation stalled. Whoever had done this had slipped through the cracks. Months then passed, then years, and although Dorothy survived, she was never the same. She had to endure repeated visits to the hospital for shoulder dislocations from where it broke, and even her face was permanently changed. It was the psychological toll, however, that was the most devastating. She became nervous, paranoid, and prone to bouts of anxiety that she fought desperately to control. She tried to pretend the fear wasn't always there and that she wasn't always looking over her shoulder, but sadly, that just wasn't the case. And that's what made what happened next even more horrifying. On the evening of October 18th, 1949, Dorothy was home alone with Marcy and Edward, while Myrna, who was 19 at the time, was out at a friend's house, and Jules was at a work banquet. 4 years had passed since the attack, and life had somewhat returned to normal, but nights like this still made Dorothy a little nervous. Around 7 p.m., Jules managed to slip away from the banquet to call home to check in, and Dorothy assured him that everything was fine there. Before hanging up, she even teased him by telling Jules to be sure to miss her. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, and Dorothy followed her usual routine. She got 9-year-old Marcy and 5-year-old Edward ready for bed and settled them in for the night. The house on North Franklin Street went quiet after that, and meanwhile, the banquet stretched on far longer than Jules had anticipated, and he didn't get back home until after 3 a.m. When he did, he unlocked the front door and stepped inside before starting to head up the stairs. As he did, though, he heard Marcy's voice sounding shaky and desperate. When he reached her bedroom, Marcy broke down, insisting her mother was gone, which Edward also repeated in panic. The two children then cried uncontrollably until Jules was able to calm them enough to learn what happened. But when Marcy was finally able to speak coherently, she told a horrifying story. She had woken up in the middle of the night and heard noises coming from her mother's bedroom. So confused, she got out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The door to her parents' room was open, and inside she saw a man standing over her mother who was lying face down on the floor. And the man wasn't someone Marcy recognized. He was white, about her father's age, and was wearing a brown hat and a brown leather jacket. And obviously terrified, she asked what the man was doing, and then he turned to her. His voice was calm, and he explained that her mother was sick, but she was going to be all right now. Then, with no urgency or panic, the man bent down and lifted Dorothy into his arms and over his shoulder. Marcy stood there frozen and watched in disbelief as he started toward the stairs. As he passed her, the man turned back and apparently patted her gently on the head. Moments later, and with the click of the front door lock, he was gone, and so was Dorothy. With nothing else she could do, Marcy then climbed back into bed, pulling Edward close. She waited in hopes of her mother coming back, but she never did, and about 15 minutes after the man left with Dorothy, Jules arrived back at home. Upon hearing his daughter's story, Jules frantically called police, and within minutes, squad cars were out at the house and officers flooded the home. Strangely though, there was no sign of a struggle. Dorothy's purse with money still inside it was untouched on a dresser, and her clothes were also hung neatly in her closet. The only thing missing was Dorothy herself. In questioning afterward, Marcy repeated her story again and again, never once telling it in a different way. Police even questioned her separately and gently prodded for inconsistencies, but she never changed her account. Authorities wasted no time in launching a full-scale investigation, and within hours they had officers scouring the city, questioning neighbors, and stopping people in hopes that something had been seen. A message also alerted authorities across multiple states to be on the lookout for a woman matching Dorothy's unique description. The first and most baffling question was how the intruder had gotten inside. Just like the attack 4 years earlier, there was no sign of forced entry. Jules had locked the door when he left for the banquet, and the door was locked when he returned. This led investigators to believe that the intruder had gotten a key to the house, but there was no indication of where he had gotten one. Not only that, but he left no fingerprints on the doorknob or the lock. In interviewing Marcy afterward, police also learned that her mother was still wearing her red nightclothes while being taken from the house. There were also no overturned chairs, the bedding was only mildly disrupted, and there were no signs that Dorothy was tossed around. Even if someone had forced her out at gunpoint, police believed they would have found signs of some kind of panic. Everything, though, was completely undisturbed, as if she had simply gotten up and gone with him willingly, although Marcy's account made it clear that this wasn't the case. With that said, investigators operated partially under the assumption that Marcy was mistaken. Investigators then widened the search to regional hospitals and private facilities across multiple states, but nothing turned up. Given Dorothy's nervous state in the years since the first attack, investigators considered the possibility that she had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered off or had been admitted somewhere under a different name. However, not a single patient resembling her had been checked into any hospital in the area. Police also kept going back to Marcy's story, but it sounded so impossible to them considering the lack of evidence at the scene. At first, detectives considered the possibility that she had misunderstood what she had seen, perhaps confusing a nightmare for reality. So to be sure, they set Marcy up with child specialists who interviewed her at length. In those interviews, based on her consistency in retelling the story multiple times, she was judged to be completely credible in her account. Her descriptions never changed, and she showed no signs of deception or fantasy. She seems to have truly seen a man take her mother from the house. But even despite this, it was a story that was difficult to accept. The events, as she told them, along with the evidence or lack thereof, just seemed impossible. And tragically, as time passed, the search for her included 11 different states, yet nothing ever turned up. As is often the case, in the absence of anything concrete, rumors spread and theories cropped up. One of the most persistent was that Dorothy was alive and hidden away in an institution, and that both her family and the police knew it but refused to say so. However, there was nothing to support this conclusion, and Jules outright denied these claims. Some also speculated that she'd been taken as an act of revenge against Jules. Maybe the attack in 1945 had been the first warning, and 4 years later someone had come back to finish the job. The most promising lead within this realm that gained traction over the years involved a 29-year-old named Morris Anmuth. He had a history with the Philadelphia police and Jules himself, and this raised interesting questions. Morris was apparently part of a large crowd gathered in protest when presidential candidate Thomas E. Dewey came to Philadelphia for a speech in September of 1944. 2 police officers found Morris and his behavior to be suspicious, so they arrested him. Morris, however, resisted, which added another charge in addition to disorderly conduct. Morris then received a $10 fine for the incident, but he refused to go away. According to Morris, afterward, the officers spent 20 minutes that day beating him. He then filed assault charges against the officers, and for a while it seemed like he might just come out victorious. That was until a new judge took over the case and dismissed it, allowing the officers to walk free. And that judge was none other than Jules. There's speculation that this courtroom decision planted the seed for a personal vendetta. It's been theorized that Morris was the man who ambushed Dorothy in 1945, attacking her as an act of revenge against her husband. If true, this theory suggests that he may have been responsible not only for the savage beating that nearly killed her, but also for her mysterious abduction 4 years later. But unfortunately, it's just a theory, and this has never been substantiated either. Jules, for his part, never stopped searching for his wife. In the years following 1949, he followed every lead and pursued every bit of information that came in. He kept a standing offer of reward money for anyone who could come forward with a clue that would lead to finding Dorothy. As time passed and each lead turned into nothing, however, he was forced to end the reward simply because he needed the money, which tragically was a quiet acknowledgement that he was running out of options. Eventually, Dorothy's name faded from the headlines, no remains were ever found, and investigators moved on to new crimes and new mysteries to solve. Jules tried to rebuild his life, but he never lost hope. He held on to the belief that somewhere, somehow, there would be an answer. In his moments alone, he would replay the events of the night Dorothy disappeared over and over, searching for the detail he must have missed or the clue that would unlock the truth. Then, in 1956, he died suddenly at the age of 49 from heart disease, going to the grave without ever knowing what became of Dorothy after that night in 1949. Almost a decade later, in 1957, a judge officially declared Dorothy dead. The only record of her existence remains in old case files and the memories of those who had known her. Even today, more than 75 years later, one item is still carefully preserved and tucked away in evidence storage. This evidence is a detailed record of Dorothy's dental work. Even after all these years, if she's ever found, that may be the only way to identify her.
If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.